The Joyous Story of Toto by Laura E. Richards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jude Summers. Chapter 2. The Golden-Breasted KooToo. "Granny," said Toto the next day, when the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, "I am expecting some friends here this afternoon." "Some friends, Toto!" exclaimed his grandmother in astonishment. "My dear boy, what friend have you in the world except your old Granny? You are not laughing at me?" "No, I am not, Granny," said the boy. "Of course you are the best friend, very much the best; but I have some other very good ones. And I have told them about your being lonely," he went on hurriedly, glancing towards the woods. "And they are coming to see you this afternoon, to talk to you and tell you stories. In fact, I think I hear one of them coming now." "But who are they?" cried the astonished old woman, putting her hand up at the same time to settle her cap straight, and smoothing her apron, in great trepidation at the approach of these unexpected visitors. "Oh!" said Toto, "they are—here is one of them." And he ran to meet the huge bear, who at that moment made his appearance, walking slowly and solemnly towards the cottage. He seemed ill at ease, and turned frequently to look back, in hopes of seeing his companions. "Grandmother, this is my friend Bruin," said Toto, leading the bear up to the horrified old lady. "I am very fond of Bruin," he added, "and I hope you and he will be great friends. He tells the most delightful stories." Poor Granny made a trembling curtsey, and Bruin stood up on his hind legs and rocked slowly backwards and forwards, which was the nearest approach he could make to a bow. He looked so formidable in this attitude that if the old lady had seen him she would certainly have fainted away. But she did not see, and Toto was used to it, and saw nothing out of the way in it.
"Your servant, ma'am," said the bear. "I hope I see you well."
Granny curtsied again, and replied in a faltering voice, "Quite well, thank you, Mr. Bruin. It's a fine day, sir."
"It is indeed," said the bear with alacrity. "It is a very fine day. I was just about to make the same remark myself. I don't know when I have seen a finer day. In fact, I don't believe there ever was a finer day. Yesterday was not a fine day. Look here," he added in a low growl, aside to Toto. "I can't stand much more of this. Where is Coon? He knows how to talk to people, and I don't. I'm not accustomed to it. Now, when I go to see my grandmother, I take her a good bone, and she hits me on the head, by way of saying thank you, and that's all. I have a bone somewhere about me now," said poor Bruin hesitatingly, "but I don't suppose she.
"No, certainly not," replied Toto promptly. "Not upon any account. And here's Coon now, and the others too, so you needn't make any more fine speeches." Bruin, much relieved, sat down on his haunches and watched the approach of his companions. The raccoon advanced cautiously, yet with a very jaunty air. The squirrel was perched on his back, and the wood pigeon fluttered about his head in company with a very distinguished-looking gray parrot, with a red tail, while behind came a fat woodchuck, who seemed scarcely more than half awake. The creatures all paid their respects to Toto's grandmother, each in his best manner. The raccoon professed himself charmed to make her acquaintance. "It is more than a year," he said, "since I had the pleasure of meeting your accomplished grandson. I have esteemed it a high privilege to converse with him, and have enjoyed his society immensely. Now that I have the further happiness of becoming acquainted with his elegant and highly intelligent progenitress, I feel that I am indeed most fortunate. But here Toto broke in upon the stream of eloquence. "Oh, come, Coon," he said, "your politeness is as bad as Bruin's shyness. Why can't we all be jolly, as we usually are? You need not be afraid of Granny. Come," he continued, "let us have our story. We can all sit down in a circle, and fancy ourselves around the pool. Whose turn is it to-day? Yours, isn't it, Cracker?" "No," said the squirrel. "It is Coon's turn. I told my story yesterday." "You see, Granny," said Toto, turning to his grandmother, "we take turns in telling stories every afternoon. It is such fun! You'd like to hear a story, wouldn't you, Granny?" "Very much indeed," replied the good woman. "Will you take a chair, Mr. Coon?" she asked. "Thank you, no," replied the raccoon graciously. "My Mother Earth shall suffice me." And sitting down, he curled up his tail in a very effective manner, and looked about him meditatively, as if in search of a subject for his story. "My natural diffidence," he said, "will render it a difficult task; but still—" "Oh, yes, we know," said the squirrel. "Your natural diffidence is a fine thing. Go ahead, old fellow." At this moment Mr. Coon's sharp eyes fell upon the poultry yard, on the fence of which a fine Shanghai cock was sitting. His face lighted up, as if an idea had just struck him. "That is a very fine rooster, madam," he said, addressing the grandmother. "A remarkably fine bird. That bird, madam, reminds me strongly of the golden-breasted KooToo." "And what is a golden-breasted KooToo?" asked the grandmother. The raccoon smiled, and looked slyly around upon his auditors, who had all assumed comfortable attitudes of listening, sure that the story was now coming. "The story of the golden-breasted KooToo," he said, "was told to me several years ago by a distinguished foreigner, a learned and highly accomplished magpie, who formerly resided in this vicinity, but who is now, unhappily, no longer in our midst."
"That's a good one, that is," whispered the woodchuck to Toto. "He ate that magpie about a year ago. Said he loved her so much he couldn't help it. What a fellow he is!"
"Hush!" said Toto. "He's beginning." And Mr. Coon, dropping his airs and graces, told his story in tolerably plain language as follows: THE GOLDEN-BREASTED KooToo. Once upon a time, and a good time it was, there lived a king. I do not know exactly what his name was, or just where he lived, but it doesn't matter at all. His kingdom was somewhere between Ashantee and Holland, and his name sounded a little bit like Samuel, and a little bit like Dolabella, and a good deal like Chimborazo, and yet it was not quite any of them. But as I said before, it doesn't matter. We will call him the King, and that will be all that is necessary, as there is no other king in the story. This king was very fond of music. In fact, he was excessively fond of it. He kept 4 bands of music playing all day long. The first was a brass band, the second was a string band, the third was a rubber band, and the fourth was a man who played on the Jew's harp. Some people thought he ought not to be called a band, but he said he was all the Jew's harp band there was, and that was very true. The 4 bands played all day long on the 4 sides of the grand courtyard, and the king sat on a throne in the middle and transacted affairs of state. And when his majesty went to bed at night, the grand chamberlain wound up a musical box that was in his pillow, and another one in the top bureau drawer, and they played "The Dog's Meat Man" and "Pride of the Pirate's Heart" till daylight did appear. One day it occurred to the king that it would be an excellent plan for him to learn to sing. He wondered that he had never thought of it before. "You see," he said, "it would amuse me very much to sing while I am out hunting. I cannot take the bands with me to the forest, for they would frighten away the wild beasts, and I miss my music very much on such occasions. Yes, decidedly, I will learn to sing." So he sent for the chief musician, and ordered him to teach him to sing. The chief musician was delighted, and said they would begin at once. So he sat down at the piano and struck a note. "O King," he said, "please sing this note." And the king sang in a loud, deep voice, "La." The chief musician was enchanted. "Superb!" he cried. "Magnificent! Now, O king, please to sing this note." And he struck another note. And the king sang in a loud, deep voice, "La." The chief musician looked grave. "O king," he said, "you did not quite understand me. We will try another note." And he struck another. And the king sang in a loud, deep voice, "La." The chief musician looked dejected. "I fear, O king," he said, "that you can never learn to sing."
"What do you mean by that, chief musician?" asked the king. "It is your business to teach me to sing. Do you not know how to teach?"
"No man knows better," replied the chief musician. "But your Majesty has no ear for music. You can never sing but one note." At these words the king grew purple in the face. He said nothing, for he was a man of few words, but he rang a large bell, and an executioner appeared.
"Take this man and behead him," said the king, "and send me the second musician."
The second musician came looking very grave, for he had heard the shrieks of his unhappy superior as he was dragged off to execution, and he had no desire to share his fate. He bowed low, and demanded his Majesty's pleasure.
"Teach me to sing," said his Majesty.
So the second musician sat down at the piano, and tried several notes, just as the chief musician had done, and with the same result. Whatever note was struck, the king still sang, "La." Now the second musician was a quick-witted fellow, and he saw in a moment what the trouble had been with his predecessor, and saw, too, what great peril he was in himself. So he assumed a look of grave importance, and said solemnly, "O king, this is a very serious matter. I cannot conceal from you that there are great obstacles in the way of your learning to sing." The king looked at the bell. "But," said the second musician, "they can be overcome." The king looked away again. "I beg," said the second musician, "for 24 hours' time for consideration. At the end of that time I shall have decided upon the best method of teaching, and I am bound to say this to your Majesty, that if you learn to sing—"
"What? What?"
said the king, looking at the bell again. "When you learn to sing," said the second musician hastily, "when you learn to sing, your singing will be like no other that has ever been heard." This pleased the king, and he graciously accorded the desired delay. Accordingly, the second musician took his leave with great humility, and spent all that night and the following day plunged in the deepest thought. As soon as the 24 hours had elapsed, he again appeared before the king, who was awaiting him impatiently, sitting on the music-stool.
"Well?" said the king.
"Quite well, O king, I thank you," said the second musician, "though somewhat fatigued by my labors."
"Pshaw!"
said the king impatiently.
"Have you found a way of teaching me to sing?"
"I have, O king," replied the second musician solemnly, "but it is not an easy way. Nevertheless, it is the only way." The king assured him that money was no object, and begged him to unfold his plan. "In order to learn to sing," said the second musician, "you must eat a pie composed of all the singing birds in the world. In this way only can the difficulty of your having no natural ear for music be overcome. If a single bird is omitted, or if you do not consume the whole pie, the charm will have no effect. I leave your Majesty to judge of the difficulty of the undertaking." Difficulty! The king would not admit that there was such a word. He instantly summoned his chief huntsman, and ordered him to send other huntsmen to every country in the world to bring back a specimen of every kind of singing bird. Accordingly, as there were only 60 countries in the world at that time, 60 huntsmen started off immediately, fully armed and equipped. After they were gone, the king, who was very impatient, summoned his wise men, and bade them look in all the books and find out how many kinds of singing birds there were in the whole world. The wise men all put their spectacles on their noses, and their noses into their books, and after studying a long time, and adding up on their slates the number of birds described in each book, they found that there were in all 9,999 varieties of singing birds. They made their report to the king, and he was rather troubled by it, for he remembered that the second musician had said that he must eat every morsel of the pie himself, or the charm would have no effect. It would be a very large pie, he thought, with 9,999 birds in it. The only way, he said to himself, will be for me to eat as little as possible until the huntsmen come back. Then I shall be very hungry. I have never been very hungry in my life, so there is no knowing how much I could eat if I were. So the king ate nothing from 1 week's end to another, except bread and dripping, and by the time the huntsman returned he was so thin that it was really shocking. At last, after a long time, the 60 huntsmen returned, laden down with huge bags, the contents of which they piled up in a great heap in the middle of the courtyard. A mountain of birds! Such a thing had never been seen before. The mountain was so high that everybody thought the full number of birds must be there, and the chief cook began to make his preparations, and sent to borrow the garden roller from John the gardener, as his own was not big enough to roll out such a quantity of pastry. The king and the wise men next proceeded to count the birds. But alas! what was their sorrow to find that the number fell short by 1. They counted again and again, but it was no use. There were only 9,998 birds in the pile. The next thing was to find out what bird was missing. So the wise men sorted all the birds, and compared them with the pictures in the books, and studied so hard that they wore out 3 pairs of spectacles apiece, and at last they discovered that the missing bird was the golden-breasted KooToo. The chief wise man read aloud from the biggest book. "The golden-breasted KooToo, the most beautiful and the most melodious of singing birds, is found only in secluded parts of the Vale of Coringo. Its plumage is of a brilliant golden yellow, except on the back, where it is streaked with green. Its beak is—" "There, there!" interrupted the king impatiently. "Never mind about its beak. Tell the Lord Chamberlain to pack my best wig and a clean shirt, and send them after me by a courier. And, chief huntsman, follow me. We start this moment for the Vale of Coringo." And actually, if you will believe it, the king did start off in less than an hour from the counting of the birds. He rode on horseback, and was accompanied only by the chief huntsman and the Jewsharp band, the courier being obliged to wait for the king's best wig to be curled. The poor band had a hard time of it, for he had a very frisky horse, and found it extremely difficult to manage the beast with one hand and hold the Jewsharp with the other. But the king, with much ingenuity, fastened the head of the horse to the tail of his own steady cob, thereby enabling the musician to give all his attention to his instrument. The music was a trifle jerky at times, but what of it? It was music, and the king was satisfied. They rode night and day, and at length arrived at the Vale of Coringo, and took lodgings at the principal hotel. The king was very weary, as he had been riding for a week without stopping, so he went to bed at once, and slept for 2 whole days. On the morning of the 3rd day he was roused by the sound of music from a wonderful dream, in which he was singing a duet with the golden-breasted KooToo, to a Jewsharp accompaniment. The king sat up in the bed and listened. It was a bird song that he heard, and it seemed to come from the vines outside his window. But what a song it was! And what a bird it must be that could utter such wondrous sounds! He listened, too enchanted to move, while the magical song swelled louder and clearer, filling the air with melody. At last he rose, and crept softly to the window. There, on a swinging vine, sat a beautiful bird, all golden yellow, with streaks of green on its back. It was the golden-breasted KooToo. There could be no doubt about it, even if its marvelous song had not announced it as the sweetest singer in the whole world. Very quietly, but trembling with excitement, the king put on his slippers and his flowered dressing-gown, and seizing his gun, he hastily descended the stairs. It was early dawn, and nobody was awake in the hotel except the Boots, who was blacking his namesakes in the back hall. He saw the king come down, and thought he had come down to get his boots; but the monarch paid no attention to him, quietly unbolted the front door, and slipped out into the garden. Was he too late? Had the bird flown? No, the magic song still rose from the vines outside his chamber window. But even now, as the king approached, a fluttering was heard, and the golden-breasted KooToo, spreading its wings, flew slowly away over the garden wall and away towards the mountain which rose just behind the hotel. The king followed, clambering painfully over the high wall, and leaving fragments of his brocade dressing-gown on the sharp spikes which garnished it. Once over, he made all speed, and found that he could well keep the bird in sight, for it was flying very slowly. A provoking bird it was, to be sure. It would fly a little way, and then, alighting on a bush or hanging spray, would pour forth a flood of melody, as if inviting its pursuer to come nearer; but before the unhappy king could get within gunshot, it would flutter slowly onward, keeping just out of reach, and uttering a series of mocking notes, which seemed to laugh at his efforts. On and on flew the bird, up the steep mountain. On and on went the king in pursuit. It is all very well to fly up a mountain, but to crawl and climb up, with a heavy gun in one's hand, and one's dressing-gown catching on every sharp point of rock, and the tassel of one's nightcap bobbing into one's eyes, is a very different matter, I can tell you. But the king never thought of stopping for an instant, not he. He first lost one slipper, and then the other. The cord and tassels of his dressing-gown tripped him up, so that he fell and almost broke his nose; and finally his gun slipped from his hold and went crashing down over a precipice. But still the king climbed on and on, breathless but undaunted. At length, at the very top of the mountain, as it seemed, the bird made a longer pause than usual. It lighted on a point of rock, and folding its wings, seemed really to wait for the king, singing meanwhile a song of the most inviting and encouraging description. Nearer and nearer crept the king, and still the bird did not move. He was within arm's length, and was just stretching out his arm to seize the prize, when it fluttered off the rock. Frantic with excitement, the king made a desperate clutch after it, and— Part II. At 8 o'clock the landlady knocked at the king's door. "Hot water, your Majesty," she said. "Shall I bring the can in? And the band desires his respects, and would you wish him to play while you are a-dressing, because you didn't bring a music-box with you?" Receiving no answer, after knocking several times, the good woman opened the door very cautiously, and peeped in, fully expecting to see the royal nightcap reposing calmly on the pillow. What was her amazement at finding the room empty! No sign of the king was to be seen, although his pink silk knee-breeches lay on a chair, and his ermine mantle and his crown were hanging on a peg against the door. The landlady gave the alarm at once. The king had disappeared. He had been robbed, murdered. The assassins had chopped him up into little pieces and carried him away in a bundled handkerchief. "Murder! Police! Fire!" In the midst of the wild confusion, the voice of the Boots was heard. "Please'm, I see His Majesty go out at about 5 o'clock this morning." Again the chorus rose. He had run away. He had gone to surprise and slay the King of Coringo while he was taking his morning chocolate. He had gone to take a bath in the river and was drowned. "Murder! Police!" The voice of the Boots was heard again. "And please'm, he's a-sitting out in the courtyard now. And please'm, I think he's crazy." Out rushed everybody, pell-mell, into the courtyard. There, on the ground, sat the king, with his tattered dressing-gown wrapped majestically about him. An ecstatic smile illuminated his face, while he clasped in his arms a large bird with shining plumage. "Bless me!" cried the poultry woman, "if he hasn't got my Shanghai rooster that I couldn't catch last night!" The king, hearing voices, looked around and smiled graciously on the astonished crowd. "Good people," he said, "success has crowned my efforts. I have found the golden-breasted KooToo,
You shall all have 10 pounds apiece in honor of this joyful event, and the landlady shall be made a baroness in her own right."
"But," said the poultry woman, "it is my Shanghai—" "Be still, you idiot!" whispered the landlady, putting her hand over the woman's mouth. "Do you want to lose your 10 pounds and your head too? If the king has got the golden-breasted KooToo, why then it is the golden-breasted KooToo, as sure as I am a baroness." And she added in a still lower tone, "There hasn't been a KooToo seen in the vale for 10 years. The birds have died out." Great were the rejoicings at the palace when the king returned in triumph, bringing with him the much-coveted prize, the golden-breasted KooToo. The bands played until they almost killed themselves, the cooks waved their ladles and set to work at once on the pie, the huntsmen sang hunting songs. All was joy and rapture, except in the breast of one man. That man was the second musician, or as we should now call him, the chief musician. He felt no thrill of joy at the sight of the wondrous bird. On the contrary, he made his will, and prepared to leave the country at once. But when the pie was finished, and he saw its huge dimensions, he was comforted. "No man," he said to himself, "can eat the whole of that pie and live." Alas, he was right. The unhappy king fell a victim to his musical ambition before he had half finished his pie, and died in a fit. His subjects ate the remainder of the mighty pastry, with mingled tears and smiles, as a memorial feast. And if the golden-breasted KooToo was a Shanghai rooster, nobody in the kingdom was ever the wiser for it. End of chapter 2.